The sterile flicker of the fluorescent tubes overhead was the pulse of a dying god, casting long, jagged shadows against Jake's face as he breached the sanctum of maximum security. Every bootfall upon the polished concrete was a rhythmic insult to the silence, a measured cadence of leather and grit. Against his chest, the new security clearance badge sat like a leaden talisman, cold and heavy with the weight of the warning it carried. Cell 5 is a void, Operations Director Amora Okoro had told him, her voice a dry rasp in the air-conditioned tomb of the briefing room. The specimen within is no mere creature. She is a walking sentence of death, a relic of a violence we have yet to categorize. Okoro's face, a map of weathered scars and corporate fatigue, had hardened like cooling slag. Do not offer sustenance. Do not offer speech. She had leaned in then, her eyes narrowing into obsidian slits. And by the ghosts of your ancestors, do not lock gaze with her. The last man who sought her eyes left behind 3 fingers as a tithe to his curiosity. Now, 3 weeks into his deployment within this subterranean purgatory, Jake found his orbit decaying towards Cell 5 like a moon pulled by a black star. His official liturgy rarely demanded passage through this sunless wing, yet he carved excuses out of the mundane. He audited equipment that was not broken. He swept perimeters that were already clean. Each passage was a transgression, a stolen glimpse through the reinforced viewing panel at the Titan confined within. This third pass was no duty. It was the hunger of the mind, a desperate itch in the digital soul to see the unseeable. The entity, a woman, his mind insisted, though the classification felt frail, sat hunched in the corner of her stone and steel womb. Even in her repose, she made a mockery of the architecture, her colossal frame a tectonic force barely contained by the high tensile chamber. The ceiling of Cell 5 climbed twice the height of the standard pens, the walls thick enough to withstand a kinetic strike, yet she made the volume feel like a coffin. Jake estimated her height at 11 feet of coiled muscle and blue-tinted meat, her shoulders broad enough to choke a doorway. She was a monument of flesh, an architectural error in a world of small men. The wardens had their litany of names. The giant, the untouchable, the beast of Cell 5. They approached her threshold with the trepidation of acolytes before a vengeful deity, always in pairs, always with the chrome of their weapons drawn and hungry. Stories circulated in the mess hall like a foul sickness, tales of research assistants nearly bifurcated during her containment, of a guard whose helmet, and the skull within, had been crushed like a dried husk when he ventured within the arc of her reach. But the rhythm of the day had shifted. She was a statue today, devoid of the restless pacing, the testing of the magnetic restraints, or the heavy, predatory respiration that usually thrummed through the vents. She was a void of motion. Jake slowed, his pulse a jagged staccato against his ribs. Protocol demanded he signal the biosecurity response unit for any deviation in the specimen state, but the cold mathematics of the facility's log suggested she was no longer a priority. She was an asset being written off in the dark. He looked to the monitor, that glass-faced snitch beside the door. Her vitals were a downward slope, the heart rate a sluggish thud, the body temperature a cooling ember. She was starving. The realization settled in his gut like a shard of ice. This was no failure of logistics, but a deliberate cruelty. The research team, the high command, the very janitors, they were spectating her slow erasure, finding a perverse joy in the stress testing of her soul. He had seen the researchers' grins, the casual malice of men who treat suffering as a data point. He had watched guards drum their batons against the reinforced glass, eager to see the flicker of agony in a captive god. Jake was no novice to the grime of the world. His service record was a ledger of moral compromises. But this was a slaughter of dignity. Without the mediation of thought, he found himself retreating toward the mess hall, his boots striking the floor with a new, rebellious purpose. The shift was hemorrhaging staff to their bunks. He piled a tray with the gray protein stew and the synthetic bread of the ranks, low-grade fuel for the meat machines of the facility. He ignored the protocols he was burning, the explicit commands he was pissing upon. He simply walked, the tray a secular offering, back straight as a spear, moving toward the dark heart of the wing. As he neared the threshold of Cell 5, a guard named Thiago Silva stepped from the shadows, his face a mask of incredulity. What heresy is this, Morrison? Silver's voice was a jagged blade of alarm. The prisoner requires sustenance, Jake replied, his tone the flat iron of a man who has already crossed the Rubicon. Silver stepped closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. You've lost your stack. That thing hasn't been fed for 3 days by design. It's behavior mod. She's meant to break. Silver's hand clamped onto Jake's shoulder like a claw. It's a monster, Morrison. If it dies, the world is a cleaner place. Step back before she takes your arm as a souvenir. Jake met Silver's eyes with a gaze as cold as a deep space vacuum. I'll take my chances with the monster. I've already seen enough of men today. The feeding slot was a narrow, armored maw at the base of the door. Jake knelt, his joints popping in the silence. Silver and 2 other onlookers stood back, their eyes wide with the voyeuristic hunger for a catastrophe. Time dilated. Jake slid the tray into the dark. The corridor was a tomb, the only sound the frantic thud of his own heart. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the viewing panel, but he felt the sudden shift of air, a displacement of mass that signaled the approach of something titanic. The observers flinched, retreating into the light. Jake held his ground, his hands still ghosting the slot. A shadow, vast and alien, fell over his fingers. Then came the touch, the whisper of blue skin against his own, digits long enough to wrap his wrist, vibrating with a tremor of either exhaustion or profound shock. Jake froze, a ghost in his own sleeve. The moment was an eternity of skin on skin, a bridge built between species in the dark. Then she withdrew. The tray was reclaimed by the shadows. There was only the soft, desperate sound of a predator eating. When the silence returned, he reached for the tray, but his palm met a small, rough object pushed back through the slot. A piece of the synthetic bread, torn into the shape of a jagged star. A piece of bread, or perhaps a soul, offered in trade. Jake pocketed the token, his hand trembling, and walked away. Behind him, Silver's voice was a ghost's whisper. She didn't try to kill him. She didn't even growl. Seeking a new mistress, Morrison? Systems Tech Arjun Ne leaned against the monitoring station the following day, his smirk a greasy stain on his face. He used the surname like a brand, a reminder of the hierarchy of the sleeve. Just the inventory of the cell, Jake replied, the lie a smooth stone in his mouth. Ne sauntered forward, his eyes bright with the fever of gossip. People talk in the vents. They say you're courting the beast. They say you've got a soft spot for the blue meat. Jake stood his ground, his chassis towering over the smaller man. If you have a grievance, file it with Okoro. Ne's grin faltered, turning sharp. I'm just wondering how long it takes for a man to forget his own kind. You know what happened to the last guard who felt pity for a specimen? It wasn't just a demotion. It was a digital erasure. Jake brushed past him, but Ne caught his sleeve, his voice a low hiss. She's picked you, Morrison. That's how they hunt. They find the crack in the armor and they pour themselves in. The warning was a catalyst, not a deterrent. Jake returned that evening, his tray laden with the illicit luxury of synthetic fruit. The guards in the wing had retreated further into the periphery, their hands hovering near their holsters, their eyes fixed on Cell 5 with the superstitious dread of sailors watching a storm front. Restless today, one muttered as Jake passed. She hasn't slept since you fed her. Just waits at the door like a gargoyle. At the door, the weight of her presence was a physical pressure, a gravitational well that tugged at the base of his skull. She was no longer hunched in the corner. She was at the glass, her indigo frame a wall of muscle that blotted out the light. He knelt at the slot, but this time, he let his gaze climb. She was sitting, yet her shoulders still grazed the ceiling, a monument of bioengineered power. Her skin was a map of ridges and old scars, her form a symphony of violence and grace. As the tray passed through, her eyes found his. They were amber basins of light, pupils slit like a predator's, glowing with a bioluminescence that felt like an intrusion into his mind. Jake felt the primitive terror of the prey, but beneath it, a resonance, the recognition of one thinking soul trapped in a cage by another. She mirrored his posture, kneeling with a grace that defied her mass, her hands echoing his own. She waited for his nod before she touched the food, her movements a delicate mimicry of the human ritual. In her grasp, the plastic tray looked like a wafer of glass, yet she handled it as if it were a holy relic. The guards behind him were silent, their cynical jokes dying in their throats. It was no longer a feeding, it was an audience. He wondered how much of her was the wild, and how much was the product of the cage. The files were a sea of redactions, but her eyes were an unedited manuscript. They burned with a fierce, cold intelligence, an awareness that had watched the cycles of the facility and found them wanting. Lieutenant Elias Thorne watched from the monitoring station, his jaw set in a hard, bitter line. He had been the one to bring the specimen to heel, had seen the blue blood on his own boots, had lost men to her fury. And now, this interloper, this Morrison, was treating the beast like a consort. It was a cancer in his pride. He had sacrificed his years to this grime, had polished his record to a high orbital shine, yet it was the new man who had earned the attention of the creature and the eyes of the director. The jealousy was a cold, sharp blade in his gut. As Jake retreated, Thorne melted into the darkness of the corridor. The decision was a cold calculation. If Jake wished to dance with the beast, Thorne would ensure the music never stopped until someone was dead. The days became a liturgy of stolen minutes. Jake brought tokens of the world, a spent pen, a button of brass, a scrap of corporate propaganda. She treated these remnants of the human world like jewels, arranging them in complex geometric patterns on the floor of her cell. Communication was a silent exchange of gestures and the heavy, electric tension of the air between them. The facility began to warp around them. The whispers grew into a low roar of suspicion. Jake's security clearance was a frequent target of audits. The other guards watched with a mixture of fear and revulsion as the 11-foot Titan moved protectively toward the door whenever Jake appeared, her massive frame a shield between him and the rest of the world. "She's claiming him," the researchers muttered. "Like a territory." Director Okoro summoned him to her office, a room that smelled of ozone and expensive tobacco. "You have a peculiar affinity for the specimen in Cell 5, Morrison," she said, her eyes fixed on the datapad. "The reports say you share your rations. That you sit with her like an old friend." "I treat the asset with the maintenance it requires." Jake lied. Okoro looked up, her face a mask of iron. "The Security Council is not interested in maintenance. They are interested in containment. They see your empathy as a breach in the hull." She leaned in. "Thorne has been very vocal about your influence. He's filed a report that reads like a death warrant." "Is he a threat?" Jake asked. "He's a lieutenant with a grievance," Okoro replied. "In this facility, that's more dangerous than a containment breach. Watch your back, Morrison. The beast in Cell 5 isn't the only one hungry for a kill." Jake left the office, the weight of the warning settling into his stack. Was he the architect of his own delusion? Was she merely a mirror, reflecting what he wanted to see? But that evening, the patterns on the floor changed his mind. She had used the tokens to build a map of the facility, a perfect, scaled representation of the corridors and the hubs. In the center, she had placed the blue button and the red paperclip side by side. But at the edge, separate and sharp, she had placed a torn fragment of a lieutenant's insignia. A warning. She knew the predator was in the vents. The crisis erupted on a night of freezing rain and supply chain delays. Jake was late, his shift extended by the tedium of logistics. As he finally approached the containment wing, the silence was shattered by a sound that made the hair on his neck stand. The sharp, braying laughter of men who think they are alone with their cruelty. He found Mateo Romero and Sora Kim at the door of Cell 5. The slot was open, and they were dangling a ration bar like a lure for a dog. "Come on, freak. Beg for the meat," Romero sneered. Kim was recording the spectacle on his pad, his face lit by the sickly glow of the screen. "Let's see if the beast can sing for its supper." Jake was a shadow behind them. "End it. Now." His voice was the cold click of a safety being disengaged. The guards spun, their faces flushing with the guilt of the court. "Just a bit of recreation, Morrison," Romero said, his hand moving to his baton. Nothing in the manual against a bit of stress testing. Return to your bunks, Jake commanded. Sergeant Malia Vane appeared at the end of the hall, her presence a further complication. I'm not seeing an authorized exercise here, she said, her eyes moving between the men. But before the argument could find its footing, the world ended. A growl, so deep it rattled the teeth in Jake's skull, erupted from the cell. Then, a thunderous impact that made the reinforced steel door bulge like wet cardboard. Another strike, and the security panel erupted in a spray of sparks. The third blow tore the door from its mountings. She emerged from the smoke like a vengeful goddess of the old world. 11 feet of indigo fury, her restraints dangling like broken rosaries. Her skin had darkened to the color of a bruised heart, the ridges along her neck flaring with a bioluminescent rage. Romero and Kim were frozen, their meat brains unable to process the scale of the disaster. Vane drew her pulse pistol, but the giant was a blur of motion. Romero was lifted by the throat, his legs kicking uselessly against the air. Kim was sent hurtling into the bulkhead with a backhanded blow that sounded like a crate of glass breaking. Vane fired, the pulse round scorching the giant's shoulder, but the creature didn't even flinch. She turned her amber eyes on the sergeant, her grip on Romero tightening. Jake stepped into the kill zone, his hands empty, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. This is not you. This is not the pattern. The giant froze. The rage in her eyes flickered, the pupils widening as she locked gaze with Jake. The predator was still there, but the intelligence regained the helm. Slowly, she released Romero, who collapsed into a heap of gasping meat. She retreated, her massive frame trembling with the effort of her restraint. She moved back into the ruin of her cell, kneeling among the patterns of her tokens, her head bowed. The alarms were a screaming chorus now, and the security teams were a thunder of boots in the distance. But Jake only saw the giant, submitting to the cage once more for the sake of the man who had fed her. The governing authority chamber was a cathedral of high-stakes cynicism. 12 hours had passed. Romero was in a med-tank with a crushed larynx. The facility was a hive of armed paranoia. Termination is the only logical conclusion, High Warden Soren Valerus declared, his voice a gavel strike in the silence. Jake stood at the rear, a witness to the high tragedy of the corporate state. The council was a collection of high-orbital egos. Valerus, Okoro, and the skeletal Dr. Ares Nakamura. The specimen is a failed experiment, Valerus continued. A liability that has breached its primary containment. The specimen was provoked, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. She showed restraint where a beast would have shown only slaughter. She could have killed us all. She chose the cage instead. Thorne stepped forward, his face a mask of righteous fury. Morrison is compromised. He's bonded with the meat. He's seen a soul where there is only a predatory algorithm. Nakamura leaned forward, his voice a dry rustle of paper. Actually, the restraint is fascinating. It suggests a cognitive capacity for empathy, or at least, for a complex debt social structure. It's calculation, Thorne shouted. She knows that killing us all earns her a one-way trip to the incinerator. Or, Okoro interjected, she recognized the only man who treated her as a sentient being. That is not calculation, Thorne. That is loyalty. Thorne slammed his fist onto the table, the sound a crack of thunder. This is madness. We are debating the feelings of a creature that could crush a man's skull between its thumb and forefinger. Valerus watched Jake with a cold, predatory interest. You believe in this soul, Morrison? You believe the beast is your brother. He smiled, a thin, cruel line. Let's test the depth of your faith. We will seal you in the cell with her. No weapons. No armor. Just the man and the beast. If your empathy is a shield, you will survive. If not, the cleaning crew will handle the remains. An hour later, Jake stood before the repaired door of Cell 5. 2 guards, their faces hidden behind tactical visors, stood ready. Okoro watched him with a look that was almost grief. You don't have to do this, Jake. It's a death trap. If I don't, Jake said. She dies anyway. At least this way, she isn't alone. The door hissed open. He stepped into the dim, electric silence of the tomb. The lock engaged behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. For an eternity, they were two statues in the dark. Jake stayed by the door, his breathing the only sound. She was a mountain of indigo in the corner, her eyes two amber lanterns in the gloom. Slowly, Jake sat on the floor, his movements deliberate. "My name is Jake," he said, the words a low vibration in the air. "Jake Morrison." She lifted her head, the light of her eyes reflecting the cold chrome of the walls. She moved then, a silent landslide of muscle. She stopped inches from him, mirroring his cross-legged seat. Then, she extended a hand. In her palm sat the metal tray, the meager rations untouched. She held it out to him, her eyes searching his. She thought he was the new prisoner. She thought he was the one being starved. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "But we share the meat. Always." He took a fragment of the synthetic bread, eating it with a ceremonial gravity. Then he pushed the tray back. She watched him, then broke the remaining loaf into two perfect halves. They ate in the silence of the damned, two ghosts sharing a meal in a cage of their own making. Thorne watched the feed from the observation room, his gorge rising. "This is a farce," he spat. "His seducing the specimen. It's a perversion of the protocol." Valeru said nothing, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Sir, we should initiate the purge now. End the embarrassment." Okoro stepped between Thorne and the console. "You've been relieved of duty, Lieutenant. Your obsession is the only perversion I see here." Thorne's face turned the color of raw liver. He turned and marched from the room, his boots a drumbeat of impending violence. The days were a fever dream of coexistence. Jake slept in the shadow of the giant, his mind a battlefield of hope and terror. But she was a silent guardian. She watched over his sleep, her massive frame a bulwark against the cold. They shared the water from a leaking pipe she had torn from the wall, her strength applied with the delicacy of a watchmaker. On the 5th day, the fever took him. A sickness of the gut or the soul, he didn't know. He collapsed into the grime of the floor, his skin a furnace, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of neon and blood. She was there instantly, her cool hands a reprieve against his brow. She used the water to bathe his face, her low, resonant sounds a lullaby in the dark. Through the haze, he heard the doctors outside, clinical voices debating his expiration. They were waiting for her to eat him. They were waiting for the beast to reclaim its nature. Instead, she cradled him in her massive arms, her strength a gentle cocoon. When the fever peaked, she moved to the door. The reinforced steel was a cobweb to her desperation. She tore the portal from its frame, the alarms screaming in protest. She gathered Jake against her chest, her blue hands a fortress of skin and bone, and stepped out into the crimson light of the emergency sirens. The guards were a wall of fire and chrome. Stun rounds struck her with the force of hammers, but she was an unstoppable tide. She absorbed the baton strikes, the electric prods, her roar of pain a challenge to the facility itself. She carried him through 5 levels of security, a titan bearing a wounded child through the fires of hell. They reached the medical bay as she collapsed to her knees, her body a map of wounds and blue blood. The guards surrounded her, their weapons humming with lethal intent. But she only looked at Jake, her amber eyes dimming. "Live," she rasped, the word a miracle of vocalization. She laid him at the feet of the doctors and raised her hands to the heavens, a captive goddess surrendering to the small men who had broken her. Jake awoke in a world of white light and chemical smells. Okoro was there, her face a mask of weary respect. "She's alive," she said, answering the question before he could ask. "She took 17 rounds to the chest to get you here. The council is in shock. They've never seen a specimen demonstrate self-sacrifice." "And Thorne?" Jake asked, relieved. "Under investigation. But he's a man with a long memory and a short fuse. Watch your fall, Jake." Okoro left, and the silence returned. But it was broken by the hiss of the door. Thorne was a shadow in the doorway, his uniform disheveled, a weapon in his hand. "You think you won," he whispered, his eyes bright with madness. "You think the beast has saved you. But I am the cure for your infection." He moved toward the four-stand, a small, dark device in his hand. A simple cardiac arrest. A tragic complication of the fever. No one will suspect a thing. Jake yanked the needle from his arm, the pain a sharp reminder of his mortality. He lunged for Thorn, the two men tumbling into the chrome equipment of the bay. Thorn was stronger, his hands closing around Jake's throat. "I'm doing this for the species, Morrison. To keep the bloodline pure of your empathy." The alarms triggered, the room flooding with light. Thorn stood over Jake, his pistol aimed at the center of his chest. "End of the line, Whisperer." But the doors hissed open, and Okora was there, her weapon steady. "Drop it, Elias. Or I'll see how your stack handles a pulse round at point blank." Thorn was taken, his screams of traitor echoing in the halls. Jake was moved to a high-security holding room, not a cell, but a sanctuary. He demanded to see her. She was in the center of the room, chained to the floor by her neck, wrists, and ankles. She was a broken monument, her head bowed in the dust. Jake stepped to her, ignoring the guards and the cameras. He knelt before her. "I am here," he said. She looked up, her amber eyes filling with a light that had no name in the human tongue. "You are alive," she said. "Because of you," he replied. He reached for the collar, that black, electronic shackle that choked her dignity. He found the manual override, a secret he had learned in the dark of his fever. With a click that sounded like the breaking of a world, the collar fell away. The alarms screamed. The guards prepared to breach. But Jake took the collar and dropped it into the incinerator chute. He turned to her, and she stood, 11 feet of indigo freedom, her head scraping the ceiling, her eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 stars. "Breach in progress." Thorn's voice, free again, fueled by a final, desperate madness, bellowed from the speakers. "Emergency purge initiated. Termination sequence locked." The room began to vent its atmosphere, the hiss of the air a death rattle. Jake reached for her hand. She took it, her massive fingers entwining with his, her strength a promise that the cage was finally over. "You fed me," she said, her voice a low thunder in the thinning air. "Now, we hunt the stars together." The door erupted in flame, and the beast and the man stepped out into the fire, finally free of the sleeve, the stack, and the facility of ghosts.